let's start then. Assalamu alaikum and Shatan salute to each and everybody. Here we are into another session of INKAAR, that is the 4th session, I think. And I'm so happy for your valuable presence here in this online lecture series conducted by Fraternity Movement, University of Hyderabad, as you all know, on Anti-CAA uprisings. And it's been a year since Indian government passed this discriminative, visibly anti-Muslim CAA, that is Citizenship Amendment Act. And we all know that most of our leaders, including Sharjil Imam, Khalid Zaifi, Akhil Gogoi, and many more are still behind bars just for raising their voice or protesting against this divisive law. And it is in this context that the fraternity movement is conducting an online lecture series, which is to keep our resistance or our learning and unlearnings keep going. So here today we have an honorable guest. You may all know him, and still for the sake of introduction, he's as we all know, he is a political anthropologist and a senior research fellow at Max Planck University, and for the study of religious and ethnic diversity. And he has also taught in many universities in countries like Australia, Netherlands, and now he is in Germany. And he was previously worked as an associate professor of political anthropology at Australian Catholic University and a senior lecturer in politics at Monash University. And he has authored and co-authored many books and journals. And he's the author of the famous book, Religious as a Critic, Islamic Critical Thinking from Mecca to Marketplace. And he had came to our college, our university in the year of 2018 for a discussion in this book. Some of you may have attended the program, I think. And he's the editor of Anthropology. He's editor of the book Anthropology and Ethnography Are Not Equivalent, and also the co-editor of the book Algebra of Warfare-Welfare. And apart from all this, he's on the editorial board of South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies, and he writes regularly for newspapers, journals, and magazines. And he comments on contemporary issues, especially on Muslim questions in India. And Professor Irfan Ahmad, I would like to invite you to this wonderful program, and we are honored by your presence here. And we are looking forward to your insightful thoughts and words here. And before going on to this talk, I would like to invite Mr. Tahiz Jamal, a PhD student from our university, will be chairing this program on behalf of Fraternity Movement to have some words with you.
Thank you, Farha. As you know, this is the concluding lecture series of INKAAR, which has been organized by Fraternity Movement. We have been having different lectures by academicians, activists, and students who were participants in this movement also. So we had different lectures by different people, including Sharjil Usmani, who is now booked by Maharashtra Police for again booked by Maharashtra Police for creating enmity between groups and all. So we want to extend our solidarity to Sharjil Usmani as well. Also, a couple of suggestions. The participants are requested to engage in the discussion directly after the talk by Professor Irfan Ahmad. Irfan Ahmad will be making his presentation, which will be almost 50 to 60 minutes. Afterwards, we can have the discussion. So in between, if you have any questions coming up, you can just text either me or the host of this program so that we can arrange you accordingly. And towards the end of the program, we will unmute those who have requested a slot for questions. We will unmute them, and we can have a meaningful and interactive session towards the end. So without much ado, I welcome Professor Irfan Ahmad for giving his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tahir and Farha. So without doing the usual ritual of thanking and so on, let us get to the task directly. You can hear me and the voice is audible. Is that all good?
Yes, yes, yeah, it's good. It's good.
Okay. So, as it was mentioned, this is the concluding session of a series on anti-CAA movement. So, many distinguished speakers have already spoken about it. So it is quite a challenge to really say something new. But I hope I do say something new, both in terms of the argument as well as method and framework. Before I proceed, I want to make a request that please have a little bit of patience, because I outline my framework and argument step by step, or gradually, so to speak, and hopefully it will be clear as I finish. So let me start with the key thesis of what this talk is all about. So the first one is that I read Shaheen Bagh as an event. And it will become clear as I proceed what I mean by event. But also, I take Shaheen Bagh as a metaphor of the anti-CAA movement through the length and the breadth of the country. Okay? So that is the first point, that Shaheen Bagh was an event. Now, this event, as I see it, has been misread or intellectually molested by what I call merchants of bullshit, or the mercenaries of untruth. And I will unpack both these concepts as I proceed. Now, to read Shaheen Bagh as an event, what I do is that I draw on some of the writings by philosophers as well as anthropologists, and some of them are Jacques Derrida, Deleuze, Gluckman, Geertz. And my main contention here is that Shaheen Bagh has to be understood as a supranational, supra-liberal, or even constitutional event, in terms of the fact that it also marks, and it does very powerfully mark, the limit and underbelly of nationalism. Now, the final argument I propose is that as an act of ethical politics, Shaheen Bagh deactivates politics, the prevalent politics, as raw calculus or sheer spectacle. Now, we all know that this movement was halted by what I describe as bureaucrats of the present, but that doesn't mean that the movement is over. Actually, what was the emergent in the movement awaits its future, and that future is in terms of the potential, not simply what is real, but what is possible, what is potential. Now, in order to lay out this argument, or rather to execute this argument, this is a structure that I follow. So first, I begin by outlining what is an event, more generally. And the second one is, from there, I proceed to describe what are the elements or the specificity of Shaheen Bagh as an event, and how these mercenaries of untruth or merchant of bullshit, they responded to Shaheen Bagh. Now, having identified the mainstream response, then I shift to describe what is the truth and method of Shaheen Bagh. And it is precisely in this section of the talk that I stress that this movement also revealed the underbelly or the limits of nationalism and liberalism to inaugurate a new language. And I will identify as I proceed what exactly is that new language. And I conclude with what is the future of Shaheen Bagh? Here, actually, my point is that it is not simply the future of Shaheen Bagh. In fact, Shaheen Bagh itself, in many ways, is future. And that will also become clear. So, what is an event? Now, one way to understand what is an event is to do it negatively, namely, what is not an event. Now, clearly, a dinner party of celebrities or famous people or conference of G8 or business tycoon, in my understanding or in this talk, is not an event. This term event is also used widely in management studies, tourism, business, sports studies, and so on. Elsewhere, which is a Dutch publishing company, it also has a book series called Event Management Series. That means that there is a field of study called event studies, which has its own theory and method. In fact, there are also degrees awarded in event management programs. But this is not what I mean by event in this talk. So this is a negative definition. So as I hinted at, here I combine or synthesize some of the anthropological and philosophical ideas about event. Now, the way event has been seen in anthropology is different. So there are three aspects of this event which anthropology, and you could also include sociology in some ways, has done this focus on event. Now, the first one is what is known in anthropological literature as rites of passage, and one could think about life cycle events. So, for example, baptism in Christianity, or Janau ceremony sacred thread ritual for twice born Hindus, circumcision among Muslims. So every society and culture has this kind of event which is centered around three key moments in one's life: birth, marriage, and death. So this is how anthropology has looked at event. The second aspect of this event is mostly in terms of public event like festival. And there is no point here going into the details of that. But this anthropologist has looked at the festival in Brazil. The third phase of this traditional way of doing an event by anthropologists has been pilgrimage. The one work that I know is on the Hindu pilgrimage site, Ayodhya, by Peter van der Veer. Now, what you see here in this traditional anthropology, the focus has always been on institutionalized, or what was called as pattern behavior. Okay, in Malinowski's famous Argonauts of the Western Pacific, he keeps stressing the typical ways. So anthropology as a discipline has been more concerned with what is regularized, institutionalized, rather than emergent aspect of our social political life. Okay. Now, there are also other ways in which anthropologists have dealt with event. And one which I find very useful was the one described by Max Glackman, who taught anthropology at University of Manchester. And there is even something called Manchester School of Anthropology, with Gluckman being founder and so on. So what Gluckman did, and this is the famous essay which he published as an article. And as you know, Gluckman did work on Africa, but this particular one is about South Africa. So he did an analysis of a bridge opening ceremony. Okay, and in anthropological literature, that is known as bridge ceremony. So what is important here, that he was focusing on an event. Okay, later on, in anthropology, this became known as situational analysis. Sometimes it is also known as extended case method. Okay, so that is one way of approaching event. The second one is, those of you who have read Clifford Geertz, his 1980 book called Nagara, which is, by the way, derived from the Sanskrit word called Nagar, which means, of course, an urban center, but it also means the power, Nagara, as in terms of the state as well. Now here, Clifford Geertz focused on one event, which was, and this is quite a remarkable event, so to speak, that the Hindu royal court in Bali, they engaged in mass suicide before the Dutch invasion. So as the Dutch colonial authorities wanted to invade that kingdom, so it is this particular event which Clifford Geertz focuses on. But from there, of course, as you know, he proceeds in a very different direction. Namely, he develops his own theory of the state. And the crux of that argument by Clifford Geertz is that his idea of the theater state. Now, in the Indian context, Veena Das and her book, Critical Events, also looked at event. But as I understand it, in her understanding, although she does refer to a French author quoting a book from 1974, which is that event is something that inaugurates things which have not been there. But by and large, much like Gluckman, okay, although I think if I remember correctly, Veena Das doesn't refer to Gluckman at all, the event functions more or less like a case studies, and she focuses on case study of partition violence, the Bhopal gas disaster and the victims, and also importantly on the 1984 anti-Sikh riots. By the way, the term riot, which Das uses, in my view, it shows her fidelity to a majoritarian language of the state, because for the Sikh as well as for a lot of other academics as well as people, it was not a riot. It is at least a pogrom or massacre, but that is a separate thing. But what I want to say here is that how anthropologists have looked at the issue of event. Now, clearly, anthropologists have not been the only one to deal with event. Historians have also looked at the question of event. And broadly speaking, we can mark three moments in the take by historians on the question of event. The first one is, we might say that it was a positivist kind of history. And by the way, the traditional historians, for them, event was actually, and I might be putting it in more exaggerated terms, but it was like bread and butter. So you might think of many works by historians, which is always about an event, and beneath the event, you might also see a temporal framework, something like from 1885 to 1888, you know, or the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and the historians write their exposition on that event. Now, there is also a philosophy behind focusing on the event in the traditional historiography, namely that these moments of rupture like war, revolution, great events, and implicitly it is also built on the idea of the great heroes being central to the motor of history, so to speak. Now, it was against this kind of established pattern that Ferdinand Braudel, the French historian, who is identified with a school called Annales School, Braudel was deeply skeptical of this whole idea of focusing on event. What was important for Braudel was not event, but process. And process for him was, it could even span centuries. So famously, Braudel said that actually even the French Revolution did not mark a rupture in his view. So this idea of longue durée is what came in the writings of people influenced by Braudel. Of course, this was in a different way later on extended by Immanuel Wallerstein, who is associated with the world system theory. Now, some people, and especially sociologists or anthropologists, they use a term called medium or demi-durée rather than long one, which could stretch for a century. Now, the most recent development in the take on event by historian is from the 1990s, and this is associated with the historian Pierre Nora. And as you could see, unlike the positivist as well as this processualist, for people like Nora, what is important is not to take the event per se as taken for granted, but to examine how event is produced. And in this kind of writing, the focus is more on modern phases or period, and of course on democracy as well as media. So in a nutshell, there is nothing inherent about the event, but rather how event is produced, fashioned, designed, constructed. Now, as we move from anthropology and history to philosophy, and that is where I think I find the contribution more illuminating. But let me say that this contribution, especially by Derrida and Deleuze, which I find very, very influential and thoughtful. The anthropologists that I mentioned earlier, they were not talking about event the way Derrida and Deleuze would later talk about. I think the someone who came closest was Gluckman, you know. Now, in these philosophical writings, what is event? So for Derrida, and I'm talking about, as you know, all major philosophers and thinkers, there is always an early and later, you know. So Derrida began to talk more about event in his later writings. So for him, the event is like the G8 meeting or a celebrity dinner. It is not planned, it is unplanned, surprising, singular, unprecedented, and exceptional. So this is one important feature of an event. And what event does, because of the above elements, it attacks the horizon of expectation itself. And these things will become clear as I proceed. And when I focus more on the Shaheen Bagh as an event. Now, because of the first and second, an event also generates vocabulary and resources in such a manner that it challenges, or it poses a challenge to the existing universe of comprehension, to our very ability to understand something. So the event, precisely for this reason, it is foreign, it is estranged to the existing order of knowing. Now, finally, an event, though it is surprising, secular, and exceptional, it is not that an event is only once. And this is a very crucial dimension for Derrida, that it implicates in and of itself in the coming back. And that is where I will conclude with. So this last point when I come to Shaheen Bagh. Now, this is the final thing before we move to the case, to the specificity of Shaheen Bagh. For deluge, and some of you probably know that for Deleuze, who was one of the major theorists of event, he also made his own death as an event in the sense that he threw himself out of his apartment, and that is how he committed suicide. But that should not engage us here. Now, what is important for Deleuze is that event marks the emergence of something potential or new. So it is not something, as the traditional sociology explanation would do, that, well, an event is reflective of the social or the political. No, it inaugurates the social and political. Okay, and that is key. The second point, and I think this is crucial, as I will elaborate subsequently, is that, and this is a deeper philosophical thing, which is about, like, a lot of philosophers have been preoccupied with the idea of being. What was important for Deleuze is not being, but becoming, and becoming as a process is, of course, agentive, and to this end, and I will elaborate it, how event also marks the onset of a different kind of interaction among languages, bodies, and body, not simply in physical terms, but also non-physical terms, and things and words. So it is precisely this element of the potential, the emergent, which is central to Deleuze. Now, how is Shaheen Bagh as an event? Now, as I see it, nobody had thought that Shaheen Bagh would actually unfold. So Shaheen Bagh as an event was unplanned, unprecedented, and this was also exceptional. And a good way to understand this is the so-called India against corruption movement. And if you compare it, India against corruption movement led by Anna Hazare and, of course, Baba Ramdev and others, it was very much planned, and additionally, it was backed by media or the power elites, which is not the case in Shaheen Bagh. Okay, so in that sense, it is unplanned, surprising, and exceptional. Now, the second element of Shaheen Bagh is precisely this moment of emergence. And you have young leaders with a very new and potent vocabulary who arrive on the scene. And nobody had expected of the kind of politics that these new leaders were doing. And mark it that the new vocabulary and the new leaders, like it is not, for example, Bihar, where I come from. So this leader is not connected to the criminal Shahabuddin or even the, soft English-speaking parasites like, Salman Khurshid or Deoband's Mahmoud Madni. It is a self-generated movement, in fact, one could even say that it is not a movement led by leaders. The traditional distinction between the leaders and the led, or the performer or spectators. Shaheen Bagh actually dissolved that duality. So that was one key specificity of Shaheen Bagh. And it did challenge the prevalent order of knowing, prevalent order of comprehension. And how it did, so let me explain this. So when I say merchants of bullshit or mercenaries of untruth, so let me explain this idea of bullshit. Of course, there is a ordinary usage of this, but the way in which I'm using this term is derived from a short book that Harry Frankfurt wrote in 2005. Those of you who are interested can read it. It is a wonderful book. It is like in a pocket size and only 50 or 60 pages. Now, what is the key point of bullshit here? The bullshit is an indifference or non-concern towards the truth. Okay? And here it is important. So for example, like if you deny the truth, or if you wage a war against the truth, that is really very different from someone, whether it is individual or institution or set of actors, when you do not have any concern with the truth itself, and in that sense, it is even more problematic if you want to speak from a normative perspective. So the key idea here is that bullshit is, I'm using bullshit precisely in this sense, an indifference or non-concern with what is true. Now, from the order of knowing in the Indian context, how did the order of knowing respond to the event of Shaheen Bagh? Well, one honest response, and if people have a sense of what might be called epistemic humility, would be to say that, look, actually, this is a new event and we do not know. And I am saying this, that what I'm going to do here is not that I know everything. I think there are many elements of Shaheen Bagh which have not been comprehended. In fact, people have not started even thinking about it, So that should have been the ideal response. But that response was, as far as I know, it was largely missing from the public domain. The most dominant response was of three types. And these types are, as you can see, they are just for illustrative purpose. One was nationalist nationalizing, the liberal, the leftist, socialist. But I want to say here with a lot of force that when you talk about liberal or leftist, and this is not simply in the Indian context, the liberal and the leftist, they already assume the idea of the nation. So they formulate their programs, they formulate their own thinking in relation to the nation, you know. So anyway, these three categories, if you want to use them as separate, but in my view, they also considerably overlap. And one key feature of that entire response from the order of knowing, so to speak, was bullshit, which was dotted at every step with some elements of Orientalism or Islamophobia. And I will give you an example as I proceed. Now, and clearly here, I'm talking more about the initial stage of the Shaheen Bagh as event. So of course, one response was that, well, you know, to the idea that, you know, it is a movement led by women, one response was that, look, actually, it is not women who are leading the movement. Men are using women, and that too for anti-national goal. By the way, mark it that one of the things about this national liberal idea about Islam in India, and you will find that in some very different ways also in Nehru, this idea that Muslims are not modern, you know, and primarily because of whatever their theology and so on and so forth. Now, this response that, you know, actually men are using women, you could see or juxtapose it against the initial or the earlier response, according to which actually women have been put or shut inside the house and they do not have any public role, you know, and this is a recurring thing which many Muslims themselves also reproduce it. Another phase of this bullshit response was that, and this was sort of like in terms of praise, that, oh, they are doing something good, but see, you know, they have finally learned the elementary lesson of how to do protest, and that too peacefully. So they are doing it not because of their own cultural resources, but it is under the influence of the dominant majoritarian / democratic culture. So we have taught them. Now, again, in one of the first reports written by liberals, so they went to the site, they saw it, and from there they would report that, no, actually it is true that there are women and there are not simply Muslims, but there are also people of other faiths. So for them, it was like a matter of surprise. So this reporting said less about what the movement is. It said more about their own Orientalist idea, which is dished by media, but also it is greatly supplied by nationalism across the party line of Congress, BJP, or whatever Samajwadi Party it might be. Now, what I mean by this bullshit, its probably most pronounced phase was the response from the intellectuals to the Delhi pogrom, which was, as you know, designed to suppress Shaheen Bagh as an event. So here you have Ashish Nandi, who says that, well, it was, in the first place, it was a riot and it was from both sides. Yogendra Yadav saying that, you know, actually nobody initiated it. It was auto-triggered. And people like Rajdeep Sardesai would come and say that, well, it is the same old thing. And I've written about it elsewhere, that it is a story of both sides. So political Hindutva versus radical Islam has created this situation. This, I think, in a nutshell, probably will illustrate what I mean by merchants of bullshit reflected in terms of response by academic, politician, psephologists, as well as media punditry. Now, another response to Shaheen Bagh was that, well, actually Muslims have begun to participate in nationalism, and you could see that they are using flag, they are invoking constitution, they have photographs of Ambedkar and so on and so forth. I think this logic, I'm not saying that this is entirely wrong, but logically and philosophically speaking, this is a contradictory logic precisely because nationalism cannot counter CAA, which itself is a product of nationalism, which is the idea of an ethnic Hindu nation. Now, of course, there was another, I mean, you might come and say that, well, we have to differentiate between good and bad nationalism. There are scholars who make a distinction between people's nationalism and state nationalism. So another explanation was that actually what Shaheen Bagh did, and this is, you might think that they are sort of contradictory or different, but in my view it is not. So which was to say that actually it was not against, it was for nation and in the cause of nationalism, but an anti-state nationalism. Now, I think this logic is also flawed. And here is a nice short quote from Arjun Appadurai, that no modern nation state, however eloquent about the virtue of tolerance, multiculturalism, and inclusion, is free of the idea that its national sovereignty is built on some sort of ethnic genius. Okay? Now, some of you might say that, well, what he wrote is applicable to situations like, Sinhalese dominated nationalism in Sri Lanka, or the Buddhist nationalism in Burma or India. But, of course, we have the nice nations of the Western world. Now, I just want to, and I deliberately chose this example, that in Europe, there are 7 monarchies, okay? And in these monarchies, there is no equality. And deliberately, I'm not saying that, so I'm talking about formal equality or inequality. Now, in these monarchies, people born in the royal family, they don't have freedom to even interact with media or articulate their political viewpoints. Even in terms of choice of their profession, they are not free to do it. So for example, members of the royal family cannot become taxi driver or sex workers, And as you know, in the case of Britain, that royal family is also custodian of the institution of the church. So that is one way to look at the question of nationalism. Now, another response to the Shaheen Bagh was that actually it is a movement which is asserting for the secular. And for illustrative purpose here, I have chosen Rajiv Bhargav's piece, which is called Return of the Secular. And in this piece, he says that secular actually equals Gandhi's vision. But in my analysis and judgment, I think this is absolutely misleading and incorrect, because to pose this, that it is the return of the secular and assertion of Gandhian vision, is to divert us both from the truth of Gandhi as well as Shaheen Bagh. And why I'm saying this, here there is a deodorized version of Gandhi, okay, as a saintly figure, but those of us who have read Gandhi critically, you know Nirmal Kumar Bose, and he was an anthropologist who also worked as secretary of Gandhi, especially in his last days, as Bangla interpreter of Nirmal Kumar Bose. And this is his, from his book, that I quote, that Gandhi tacitly formed an alliance with those who believed in a restoration of Hindu domination. So I think this idea of Hindu domination, if Nirmal Kumar Bose is right about Gandhi, will not analytically sit comfortably with the idea of a secular vision. There's a lot of media propaganda also that, well, Gandhi was against, he supported Khilafat movement and he was against Zionism. Actually, now the new research based on the secret correspondence, it shows that actually Gandhi backed the Zionist project. And as I will show next, that he was far from an icon of non-violence. Actually, he did justify, and he was in favor of violence. But more importantly, what I want to say is this, that this idea of the secular, you know, and here let me make a distinction. So if secular is about dealing with religious differences, about political participation in a multi-religious polity, then we all know from the Mughal history or the history of Islam elsewhere that this idea has been there, okay? So what I'm saying here as secular, the way it operates as an ideology, as a repertoire of politics, it is not about the fact of dealing with religious difference or diversity, but as an ideological weapon. And in that sense, you could see that secular basically works as an imagined Hinduism, as you could see in the work of S. Radhakrishnan, and as an arm of majoritarian power, as it is in the case of West. So all that I critiqued before, okay, like this different faces of bullshit from different quarters or different sectors of life, you know. Now, let me say, so my point is not that those things did not happen, you know, or that is, let me put it this way, that is how these scholars or thinkers have looked at it. Now, here comes my take. In my view, and I will illustrate it rather than simply making a claim, that Shaheen Bagh was actually the most political movement against politics itself. This was an ethical call to rethink the diet of nationalism and liberalism. It was a call to imagine the polis, right, in terms of a political society or the common good, differently and anew. So, but this requires explanation. How? Now, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, there is a term called over-identification, which was used later on by a lot of other people, but including Slavoj Žižek. Now, this over-identification is a concept or term which means that actors identify with certain symbols not to sacralize them, or at least, or they might even be doing on the face of it, you know, but by identifying in a more intense way, they actually subvert it, or they show the limits or the underbelly of those very concepts. So Slavoj Žižek, he wrote in the context of totalitarian communist state. So, which is to say that in a political space which lacked freedom. And I think in India, despite this hangama of democracy and so on and so forth, we all know how little space or how genuinely democratic space in terms of creativity is left. So now if you see Shaheen Bagh through this concept of over-identification, so of course people used constitution, flags and all the icons and so on and so forth, but not to sacralize them or not to worship them, but they did it in a manner to display the hollowness, violence, and absurdity, which is at the heart of nation thinking and nationalism. If this sounds a little bit abstract, maybe during the discussion I can explain it, you know. Now, if you want to see one empirical example of this, so when the protesters, they were confronted with the unprecedented or the gigantic violence unleashed by the police, which is another phase of the state brutality, they seem to be confused, like if these police officers, if they were betraying or following Gandhi, who is depicted more popularly as the icon of nonviolence and nation. And elsewhere I've written, you know, that Gandhi in 1930, he justified the, you know, mass killing of unarmed followers of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was the leader of Khudai Khidmatgar movement. In December 1947, which is only a few weeks before his own murder, Gandhi justified blatant violence in an imagined or hypothetical war against Pakistan if Muslims betrayed the Indian state or Hindus, you know. So, so if this was one way to show the limit or underbelly of nationalism and liberalism, they also seem to suggest, and this is a more here, as you can see, this is an interpretative leap that I'm making here, okay? So the protesters, and of course, now you can say that, you know, which protester are you talking about? All the protesters are not same. There are differences in terms of language because, you know, there were protests in North and South, and then, you know, the small towns, big towns, so on and so forth. But if that is the concern, we can talk about it later on. But they seem to be saying that, look, all that you pedagogized us for long, you know, that you must do these acts. We have been doing all this, and yet you continue to cast us as the outcast. And in my interpretation, these protesters were also telling the custodian of nation and nationalism that why do you continue to classify almost in a non-stop way? Why do you continue to classify us as enemy, even as with our body, soul, and tongue, which we have been doing for long? We are continuously enacting friendship, qua friendship, you know? Finally, I think they were also asserting that why does nation in whose name you seem to speak and act actually need an enemy? And they were indirectly suggesting that can we think, can we conceive of a political community which is not predicated on the necessity of an enemy, internal or external. So I take what I have said so far, I take it, I have to also look at time. So, okay, I have to quickly finish it. So just bear with me for another 5 or 6 minutes. So if Shaheen Bagh as an event in terms of emergence or in terms of emergent and potential, rather than existent. So what was the subject of this emergent event? Now, clearly, these people spoke as Indians, and which has been highlighted. What I want to add here is that, of course, they spoke as Indians, but they also spoke as less and more than Indian. They spoke as sheer human who does reside and belong to a nation, but the being and the becoming of that individual cannot be reduced to that. So, and some of you who might have read this piece, this essay that I wrote on Shaheen Bagh, where I focus on suffering and pain, So if you look at the victims of the state brutality, they foreground their pain and suffering in reconstituting themselves. And there, the appeal and the modes of describing the suffering itself is purely in terms of human, in terms of sheer corporeality, and in so doing, I think they were setting a much more challenging task than simply become Indian, true Indian, or whatever that be. And that task is to echo Ghalib. Those of you who are interested or fascinated by Urdu poetry, I think this is one of the, forget about the whole couplet, just the last line, कि आदमी को भी मुयस्सर नहीं इंसान होना. Let me say on a side note that a lot of people these days, they think that admi basically means man, but this is not what is the sense of Ghalib. Admi means, as a species, humans different from, say, other species. So when he says that, admi ko bhi muyassar nahi insan hona, that is one of the most or rare line written, not simply in Urdu poetry, but I would say even in world poetry. So these protesters, they were putting themselves also as human, which has not been given sufficient space. So this is about the emergent subject. Now, what is the plane? So Deleuze uses this term called plane of immanence. So as he's against transcendentalism, so for him what is important is plane of immanence. Now, what is the plane of emergence here? And I'm using it in a different way. Of course, these people were invoking nation, but at the same time, there was a powerful discourse which is about transcending the nation and encompassing the entirety of the earth and the sky. And I think the most radical element of that Shaheen Bagh as an emergent moment was to adopt the very poetry of Faiz, who has been described. And I think in Kanpur or somewhere there was at IIT Kanpur even a committee to set up to inquire into the poem of Faiz. So the most radical element was to adopt the poetry of Faiz, who has been described as a poet of the enemy nation, which protesters did. But what is crucial here is that by adopting I think probably adopting is not a right word, because they were enacting, and enactment is very different from simply reading or singing even. So by enacting that poetry of Faiz, it is not that they were being disloyal to India and faithful to Pakistan. Rather, in enacting that poetry, they were writing the obituary of nationalism as a sports on either side of the border. And this, I think, is very courageous act, because to write an obituary of something which is not dead yet is far more challenging than, of course, writing the obituary of someone who is dead. In so doing, so they were showing through their bodily act the absurdity of nationalism as a game of sports or jingoism. Now, in Amir's poetry, of course, he does speak about Watan and so on and so forth. But as you could see, he talks about, कि तुम ज़मीन पे जुल्म लिखो. So the entirety of the earth, or it is zulm, not of one community or one section, but zulm in its entirety on the face of the earth itself. And likewise, in his response in his radical response when he says that I'm going to write inqilab against this zulm. So what is the plane on which he aims to write? It is the entirety, the whole sky, which is borderless. So that is the plane of the emergent. Now, this is the final section where I want to talk about that. Was there a culture of that emergent, of the potential? Okay. And I think there is, which to the extent that I know nobody has talked about. So one of the major episodes of this entire anti-CAA movement was, as you know, I maybe I'm not correct about the exact date, but in mid-December, when these students in Jamia were mercilessly beaten to the extent that they were chased in their library, by the police. And some of these students had nothing to do with the protest, but they were mercilessly beaten, And despite that merciless beating, and as you could see, I'm talking here now mid-December, but in January and subsequently when the nationwide movement happened, especially in UP, the ferocity with which the police attacked and killed, I don't remember the exact numbers, but probably there are more than 30 or 35 protesters who were killed by the police. Now, despite that terror of the state, if some of the protesters were offering flowers to the police, how do you culturally explain this? In my view, I think this recalls an event from the life of the Prophet. As you know, in Mecca, there was an old woman, and Prophet would pass by, and she used to throw garbage on his face. And Prophet never lodged a complaint, but one day that lady did not do what she has been doing so far. So the Prophet asked, like, what happened to that lady? And as the event stands, she was sick on that particular day. So the Prophet goes and pays a visit to that old woman. So I think this act of offering flower to the police it draws on that cultural resources, which was the moment of emergent in Shaheen Bagh. Now, another phase of this emergent moment is the enactment of sabr, which popularly is translated as patience, which is quite misleading. Sabr is steadfastness and continuous non-stop endurance in times of trial, tribulation, and difficulties, and to remain faithful to the truth. That is the idea of sabr. So confronted with this violence, if a woman shields one of her friends, and in this later stage, with her index finger, if she is pointing to the police, this is a remarkable act of sabr. Because as you know, when you offer salah or namaz on second rakah or on the fourth, you also raise your finger, which is to affirm the oneness and the singularity of God. And this is again here an interpretative leap that I'm making. So in this act, you could see that this raising of, and in Urdu actually that index finger is also called as shahadat ki ungli. So this is affirmation of oneness and singularity of God against a ruthless power, which is completely unmindful of that message and arrogant in its own worldly ambition. But I want to make here another connection. Etymologically, Shaheed and Shahada, they are connected. These three words, Sheen, He, Dal, are common both in Shaheed as well as in Shahada. So this act is simultaneously an act of signaling identification with martyrs, from lynched Hafiz Junaid Pahlu Khan to the victims of the landless and the poor victims of the Bathani Tola massacre, to the post-1857 lynching by the British. By the way, the way the lynching happened, it reminded one of what happened immediately after 1857 rebellion in Delhi. So when Shadab Farooq did it, I think people have not done enough work on this. That what does this act mean, you know? And I want to juxtapose it, those of you, and I've written about it in EPW, about Mufti Qayyum. So when under custody, when Mufti Qayyum was beaten by the police, of course, illegally, and this was like a team of a stick wielding people. Mufti Qayyum is the one who was sentenced to death for his unsubstantiated role in the attack on Akshardham temple. So he used to say Allahu Akbar under severe pain. And Vanzara, who was the police officer, who would say in arrogance that if God is on your side, so you recite Bismillah or Kalma, and I want to see where is God. And simultaneously he would say that, look, I have the power. I control things, you know? So in a manner in which the state authorities usurp power in order to decide the life and death of its people, you know, the saying of Allahu Akbar at every harsh beating meted out to Mufti Qayyum by the police, you know, it is to show the limit of a power that has lost its own sense of humility or its own sense of reasonability. So in the same way, I think if Shadab is marching towards this guy who has a loaded pistol, you know, it is an act of fearlessness, you know, and telling that, look, my life and death is not predicated on your power, which you certainly have, as you could see that, you know, the police behind is simply watching on, you know. So this is the culture of the emergent in Shaheen Bagh was this aspect of fearlessness. And mind you, and this is the key point of the whole idea of becoming, is that as Shadab is marching, you know, he's not simply displaying his being, which is already there. Rather, in the process of marching, he's becoming, you know, and this process of becoming, this process of renewing, transforming yourself is something crucial, which we have not paid much attention. Now, this is the, I'm sorry, I think it is going, but definitely in next 3-4 minutes, I want to conclude. So what is the future of Shaheen Bagh? So in the abstract, when I say that, you know, it was an event marked by poetry, so I take poetry as something which is, there are many things in poetry, but the one which is relevant here is the idea of creativity, to make something new, you know, to break away from the established boring practices. So in that sense, poetry is not about being, rather in the responses from the order of knowing, which I described as bullshit. It is not even being, but what you have been made, or what you have been pigeonholed to in terms of your being. So this poetry as a moment of becoming. Now, all these activists, and for the sake of time, but let me just mention a few, Shajil Imam or Safura Zargar or Natasha Narwal, Kafil Khan, and many others. It is not activists who have been put in jail. It is the incarceration of poetry. It is the imprisonment of the act of becoming, you know. But as you know, Judith Butler has written about it, that even from Guantanamo Bay, poetry has escaped. There were people who were writing poetry inside the most sophisticated installment, as they say, of incarceration in the world. So poetry in the form of becoming, poetry as a moment of creativity will emerge successful despite the fact of being imprisoned. In the ultimate analysis, this will not succeed. And precisely because of that, recall one of the final elements of the event, as Derrida had outlined it, that there is an event, and this might sound paradoxical that, well, if it is singular and unprecedented, so how it is going to repeat. So the event, we can discuss that later. So event, if it is, because of its very emergent and potential nature, it is not an one-time affair, you know, but if it also repeats itself, which in my view it does, then I think Shaheen Bagh is far from over. Actually, it has not even properly begun, you know. it has laid the groundwork for something to come. And that something to come is the horizon of future. And this time, when it comes in the future, it will be even more surprising, even more unprecedented and shocking than we have seen until now. And you could see that actually there is a buzz about that emergent and the potential. I think many elements of the farmer movement has that buzz. But even from the side of those who wield power, you know, you could see. I don't want to repeat this, but this was a powerful share of Hassan Naeem, that बामे खुर्शीद से उतरे के न उतरे कोई सुबह, खीमे शब में बहुत देर से खुराम तो है. So I will not translate, and I think I have spoken for long. I will stop here. So thank you for listening. I'm sure I've said so many things which requires a lot of clarification, and you may have already so many questions. So I look forward to have your thoughts and reflection.
Thank you very much, Professor Irfan Ahmad. What should I say? It was such an interesting and enlightening lecture. I thought of summarizing the lecture initially, but after your talk, I'm sure it will be an impossible task to summarize the talk right now, as each slide was so full with too much content and arguments. So the better option, I think, now will be to directly move to the Q&A session. So the session now is open.